So a mosque gets bombed in Minnesota over the weekend, and we're at the 5-year anniversary of the shooting of the Sikh temple in the Milwaukee area. And there's been several Hindus actually killed this year, probably because people thought they were Muslim, because white supremacists aren't necessarily the smartest people in the world. Which I laugh at a little bit, but obviously this is serious. This is loss of life stuff. My accountant, Aash, who is fantastic, you can find out more about him at mzpartners.com if you need one. I went through about 4 accountants before I found one I really liked. He and I got into a discussion on Facebook after I condemned the caste system in India and Hinduism, because the government in India kicked out Compassion International, who I have traveled with, and I have seen their work in Mexico. And they were feeding like 135,000 kids nutritious food in India who were living in poverty. They were kicked out for supposedly proselytizing. I can't tell you if that's true or not. I haven't been to India. I haven't seen what's going on there. But either way, most of these kids did not get picked back up, most likely by another NGO, by another nonprofit to help with their nutritional needs. I was pretty ticked off about that on social media, and he and I got into a bit of discussion about it. This is about not just Hinduism, but Hinduism, Sikhism, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and how those 5 belief systems all exist in India and in Pakistan and the Punjab region, and how they affect not just the international relations between 2 countries with nukes pointed at them over there, but how those things kind of mix into American culture and what that means, and how often they're misunderstood, like when we call terrorists towel heads. Well, people in Saudi Arabia do wear like a I don't know what you call it, like a hat thing, right? But a lot of times people who get the slur towel head thrown at them and called terrorists are actually Sikhs, and they have to wear a turban because they're not allowed to cut their hair, and it has to be bound up in a turban for religious reasons that have nothing to do with Islam. They are so far away from Islam. It's like not even funny. They're night and day. Other than both being monotheistic religions, they're not comparable at all. So we get into what those different things mean and how those different groups coming to the United States are often taken by white supremacists as the same thing. But also it's important to understand why they're different, because those 5 groups being in conflict actually relate to a lot of what's going on in the world. In the Middle East, in the Balkans, and in Africa as well, you often have 2 major and 3 minor players, and trying to figure out how to cool the temperature down and create some kind of peace there. We don't get to an answer, but at least when you get to the end of this thing, I believe you'll have a better view of the different belief systems that come out of that region, and why there's conflict, and maybe why there's hope that we could get closer to peace, both there and over here. All right, let's do it. My name's Seth Towerherd. Let's be neighbors again.
And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
We're going to wrap several things together that may be disjointed for this episode, but for a certain group of people, they see them all as all the same thing. There was a bombing in a mosque in Minnesota over the weekend. Nobody was killed. We are at the 5-year anniversary of a Sikh temple in outside of Milwaukee, basically, where white supremacists killed several members of the temple there 5 years ago, this past weekend. And we're in a year where several Indian Americans have been killed over, I think, actually, the misunderstanding that they're Muslims, because white supremacists aren't always the highest on the IQ level. And so, there's sort of this conversation within, people of Indian descent or immigrants or whatever, just saying like, okay, so what does this mean when I'm actually Hindu or Sikh? Well, kind of more obvious if you're Sikh. You can tell that if you're familiar with the Sikh belief system. But my friend Ash is my accountant, and you grew up in Flint. And so we're going to kind of wrap all these things together and get into them. So you grew up in Flint as a Hindu. Was that a big deal? I mean, was everybody just kind of cool with it? Like, how did you feel compared to the way you feel now just walking around?
Sure. I didn't feel any different growing up in Flint because I think my parents made a really big effort to expose us to the culture that they were brought up in. And so, we were brought up around a lot of other Indian families with similar religious background. And I guess, so I had my American friends that I went to school with, and then I had my Indian friends that, from the community there. So I guess I never really felt, I mean, when I went to school, I went to a small private school growing up, and I was never disrespected or treated as other. I think people kind of approached it out of curiosity when they would ask about religion or culture or, these type of things.
And did you, so there was, what, did your parents immigrate? Did your grandparents immigrate? I mean, have you been here for 150 years? Like, what, like, when did your family come over? Because for the most part, Indian Americans have arrived in the last century, right?
That's right. So my parents came in the early 70s, mid 70s. And at the time, there was kind of an open door for immigration for people in the medical profession. There's a shortage of staff, need for that at the time. So my mother and father came over at that time. My father's a physician, still a working physician in Flint. And they originally immigrated to Detroit, where my father's college friend and former roommate was a physician there. So he kind of encouraged them to come, and that's sort of how we got set up in Michigan. But my father is actually from East Africa.
Oh, really?
He was born and raised in Tanzania. So his family had immigrated from India to Tanzania sometime before. And my mother was born and raised in India.
I went to college with a kid like that was very confused when he got here to go to school from Africa, because he was ethnically South Korean, but his parents had moved for some kind of advanced jobs. They'd moved to Africa, and he heard black students call themselves African American, and he's like, "Well, what am I?" Like,
that's right.
I am African. He is. He's African.
Yeah. There's so many race classifications now. So, I think South Asian is the term for people like me. But if I say Asian, then I'm seen to be misrepresenting myself, right? I have to specify what type of Asian,
Yeah. So. And a quick aside on this. One of the things is we talk about, we're in an administration where immigration is being clamped down on. One of my good friends is in cold storage warehousing, which is a really hard job. It just is. I mean, if you can imagine working in a freezer all day, 8 hours a day, people who do that are first generation immigrants from Latin America or Eastern Europe. That's it. It's very hard to get somebody who was born in America, at least in a major city. I think when you talk about growing up in farm country, it's a little different, but it's just hard to get people to work like that. So one of the things his industry is facing is, with less Hispanic immigrants, we just don't have maybe enough labor to keep growing. So it's like, it doesn't matter what we pay. We can pay a lot more, and people are still going to quit after a couple of days because it's so hard. The other thing we're facing here in the United States is, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but people are freaking lazy. And there are certain careers that they just don't want to do the work to do. And the medical career and what they call the STEM careers, like science, technology, engineering, math. The reason that we have so many people who are immigrants in those jobs is because Americans don't want to do them, and the Americans who can do that stuff usually are at the top of the IQ chart or whatever. They all go into finance because you can make so much more money in finance than you can in STEM careers here. So what we wind up having to do, and this is a huge problem in particularly in the tech industry, is we have to import all these people. And a lot of times we can only keep them for like 2 years or something like that because they're on a work visa, and then they got to go away again and then maybe come back. And these companies cannot staff with American workers because American workers, they're too lazy to do the manual labor on the one end, and they're not good enough at science and math to do the intellectual work on the other end. And this is coming from somebody that freaked out and got a 13 on the the math part of the ACT. So it's not like I'm being super judgmental of why are you so dumb you can't do these careers. But I believe that this is actually going to have a negative effect on our economy. That when industries can't get the employees they need and they can't import them, we're going to be in trouble. And it hasn't shown yet because it's only been 6 months.
Right, and then I think that also encourages more hiring. If we can't find the people to do the jobs here, and there's a possibility, the type of job that can be done elsewhere, that's what will happen. I'm seeing that in my field actually a lot. A lot of the bookkeeping and payroll processing jobs and that kind of thing are going overseas. Even local small accountants are outsourcing this stuff through various firms who have established centers in particular India and the Philippines to handle bookkeeping at a much cheaper rate. So, if I want to pay somebody a bookkeeper's rate in Chicago between $15 and $20 an hour, I can also pay for about $5 an hour out of pocket and have it outsourced.
And depending
sorry
on
to get a little off topic there, but
no, depending on what the industry is, right. You can whine about how that's anti-American all you want. Depending on what the industry is, you can get some excellent results or you can get some very not good results. So for example, like with website coding, you're getting, because I work in websites, right? So you're getting a lot of people in Eastern Europe that are doing it. You're getting a lot in India, and you're getting a lot in the Philippines. I found that to be very hit or miss because bookkeeping is, the numbers either add or they don't, right?
Right.
When you get into coding, which is much more, you've got to be up on what's going on in the last 6 months. It's pretty binary. Like somebody's either amazing or they're terrible. And when they're amazing, a lot of times, they're half the price of here or something like that. Probably the best example of how well this works. This was in the news, 3 or 4 years ago. A guy that was a state employee in something like bookkeeping for the state of California, and he was supposedly working from home. He outsourced his entire job to India. He had a second full-time job and had 2 incomes.
Oh, wow.
So,
I have to look this one up.
If I was an accountant, I could outsource everything. Maybe you're missing the boat, man. Maybe you don't need to work at all. But getting into
I suppose if I want to be a reseller of services, right?
just have the storefront and ship it off to somebody halfway around the world, and and a lot of times this is a complicated issue as far as doing that, and people I think traditionally the more democratic position, and now I don't know if I wouldn't call it a Republican position, but the Trump position is like, oh well, these poor people who are being made obsolete, let's help them. You're only going to slow it down for a few years, right? Like bookkeeping is now a global industry, and you got to find a niche. You got to find a way to be better. You got to find a way to give customer service. Same thing with what I do. You can hire somebody to do social media in Bangladesh or Italy if you want to, right? And when we try to protect those jobs, unions now are trying to block automated vehicle technology, realizing that truck driving is going to go away. Well, you know what? Truck driving is going to go away. Maybe we will have several years where somebody just sits there and monitors things. But the idea that you will manually operate a vehicle that's carrying, salsa from Austin, Texas to Kansas City for, to be distributed to grocery stores, the idea that that's going to be a career in 15 years, you're kidding yourself. And so we can fight against that. Or it's a much more complicated conversation as far as what we do with society. But the bottom line is when that goes away, other jobs come into play, like the people who program those trucks to make sure they work right. And usually it just keeps economies in recessions longer when we fight against change or we prop up dying industries. This might step on your toes because you're from Flint, but that's one of the reasons, like, I would rather die than ever buy a General Motors or Chrysler product after, they were bailed out by the U.S. government, because if they would have gone into bankruptcy, they would have probably been bought by one of them would have been bought by a Toyota and become more efficient and produced a better vehicle. But we propped them up with American tax dollars, and they never, neither one of them ever fully repaid the loans. They repaid a good chunk of them, and I suppose that's admirable. But that's just not something I'll ever support with my purchase. Which, by the way, did you feel that growing up in Flint? Did it feel like everybody had made a living off the auto industry, or, second step?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I sort of saw the city kind of peak and then go through the decline, right? So in the 80s, growing up there, all my classmates, everybody knew somebody or had a family member or someone was in the automotive industry. And even if your family wasn't in the automotive industry, that's what supports up what props up the whole town. So it was pretty clear to see when the decline began. And I remember seeing all these signs around town that would say, it would say something like, buy an American car or apply for Japanese welfare. They really kind of dug in their heels on the quality of their vehicles. They just were subpar at the time. And I think after the decline kind of passed the point of no return, they started to realize and acknowledge that, there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of quality control issues. You can't produce 5 cars under one factory and badge them all differently, or different marketing strategies and different distribution channels, and make that a feasible practice. So I think that, I agree with bailout was not perfect by any means, but ultimately what we have today, I think, is a far better quality of product coming out of the American automotive industry.
Yeah, the irony is I actually think General Motors is producing an excellent product these days. I think Chrysler is a garbage company that will always be a garbage company. The funny thing is everybody, in the auto industry knows it. Like, day in, day out, like the company or the cars made by Fiat, which is ironically, by American. Chrysler's owned by an Italian company now, right? And right. They sell a ton of them because aesthetically they're very pretty. And they're garbage vehicles. They just are. I mean, every single Consumer Reports and Car and Driver and all that stuff always says, basically, these are crap. Like the Fiat 500, which is sort of like the Mini Cooper, is so popular in the United States. I had to drive one as a rental car, and I'm like, this does feel good. The wheels are going to fall off at 20,000 miles, but the stereo is great.
How do you fit in a Fiat 500?
You know what? Actually, they're really roomy. Actually, if it was a piece of crap car, I would love it.
Because you're a tall guy, right?
Yeah, I'm 6'6".
Yeah.
I totally. I mean, seriously, if it was made by a reputable company, it would be a great commuter car. It really would. And the new ones have Beats audio in them. And so, I mean, I think they're doing a lot of things right. They just don't make good motors and transmissions and brakes and other things that make cars run. So
right.
we diverged a little bit from the from the topic here. And I will say, despite my feelings, the fact that both of those companies have come back so strong, certainly would point to the fact that maybe that was the right idea. I just go back to it was 2008, 2010, right in there when things are going so bad. Well, why were they special? Why didn't we just bail out 30,000 small businesses and save the same number of jobs? So I emotionally I can't do it. But I don't think it's an unreasonable purchase.
Yeah. And I also think, because I grew up in Michigan and there's so many ties to the industry there, I think it would have really been devastation for that state in particular had those, the big three been allowed to fail. And I think that General Motors and Chrysler had taken more advantage of the bailout, I think, than Ford, if I remember correctly. Ford or a line of credit or something.
Yeah. It was a totally different situation with Ford. So I feel differently about Ford vehicles. I drive Hondas because I mean, my last Honda died with 314,000 miles on it. That's just kind of hard to argue with.
Oh yeah, you can't. I mean, if you have that kind of experience with one car, my dad's always had a Japanese car for probably since the early '90s, and he just keeps going back to the same brand over and over because the experience has been great with every single one of those cars. So.
Well, and okay, we got to get back into the main topic, but yeah, as far as people's preference on stuff like that, it's like, we have two Hondas right now. I know what's going to go wrong with them. I know the stupid automatic windshield up-down motor is going to, go out. I know that's about $250. I know it happens on every Honda. I know how to, pop in a headlight or a tail light real quick. Like I know kind of how those cars behave, so I kind of keep going back to the same thing, which is how you used to have, kind of Chevy families and Ford families, because people actually used to, believe it or not, work on their own cars. America, I know it's crazy, right? So getting back to your experience growing up, growing up Hindu, so it really wasn't a big deal as a kid. Like, does it feel like more of a big deal in 2017 America to be minority? Would you call yourself Hindu now, or would you not, or where do you land on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, it absolutely wasn't a big deal. And, like I said, there was so much exposure. And in fact, on Sundays, when we would go to the temple for our classes and things, they would bring in faith leaders from other faiths to kind of teach us about Judaism or Islam or Christianity or whatever. So I think that was one of the really cool things about growing up in that community. We didn't just learn about our own. We got exposure and, the opportunity to learn about everybody else. And I think that process makes you feel less different because everybody's different, right? Now, today, I live on the north side of Chicago, and what previous census reports have indicated as the most diverse code in the country. So I don't necessarily on a day-to-day basis in the urban environment of the city feel different. The interesting thing is when I travel, that's when I wouldn't say it's like negative energy that I can sense, but I can definitely sense that, people notice. Whereas here I can kind of walk around undetected just as a normal citizen of the neighborhood. If I am, for example, I was in South Carolina last year for a good friend's wedding. I could feel the glances at the airport kind of as I was walking to baggage claim and that kind of thing. So I think that's where I notice it. I kind of live in a bubble. So a lot of what I notice is other people's experiences that I'm reading about or hearing about. My parents still live in Flint. They don't complain about being treated differently. It's still a very diverse area where they live. And they still have their, close community. There's a big Indian community there. But yeah, I think for me, I'm kind of in this little bubble here in Chicago, and the traveling that I do, I tend to go visit my parents in Michigan, or I go to Milwaukee frequently. I don't see or experience any sort of negative energy being directed towards me. I would say it's more noticeable if I go out to the Chicago suburbs and that kind of thing.
And I think I'd mentioned, I don't know if I'd mentioned this to you before, but what's very funny about, kind of my appearance. So my grandfather was mixed blood, Native American and white. And so I get pretty dark in the summer. And, like one of the ways you tell somebody's ethnicity is hair. Well, I shave my head, and my beard is pretty, kind of like Wisconsin flannel shirt wearing thick, right? Occasionally in Chicago, somebody will ask me if I'm Arab.
Really?
In the summer, yeah, which is hilarious. I was like, no, and I hope no, I hope I don't get beat.
I often get mistaken for, I get mistaken for Hispanic in the sense, like sometimes I'll go to a restaurant and they'll just start speaking to me in Spanish. But again, I think, I live in an area that is
diverse enough that kind of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I bring all this up because I'm tying several things together here in this episode. But one of them is the fact that just several Indian Americans have been randomly killed, clearly for race, and it's most likely because people who are white supremacists just think, oh well, there's terrorism going on here, and that's clearly like you have to have a very, very narrow view of the world to think that. Hinduism and Islam or whatever, Christianity and Islam are the same thing. I think there's like 27 million Christians in India, and have been since very, very early on in Christianity. And then Sikhs are a completely different monotheistic, religion, and it's crazy to think that huge religious differences here, right? And this isn't really a show about religious belief, but it's funny because actually maybe if you should be scared of somebody, it's Sikhs, because they're required to carry a knife at all times, and you can recognize a Sikh because they wear a turban, and they're not supposed to cut their hair. I've noticed that the Sikh family that runs a convenience store near me, actually the younger guys all wear baseball caps, but they're covering their hair because they're not allowed to cut it. It's part of their monotheistic religion. I decided I'm a fifth Sikh because I normally have a pocket knife on me.
Yeah, a lot of these attacks have been carried out of mistaken. I guess this sort of racist hatred is born out of ignorance, right? And so you see that play out when these people don't even identify their intended targets properly, and just go after somebody based on appearance, which we just had the 5-year anniversary of the
shooting
massacre.
Up in Milwaukee.
And it's very clear that is not a mosque. There's no Arabic script anywhere on that property. There's clear architectural differences between a gurdwara and a mosque, but someone might not know that. But it says gurdwara on the sign. So it makes me think, was this just a hasty decision that this guy just was so full of anger he had no time to even figure out who the target was before he went in? Or
well, it was he was having psychological episodes in the army. I actually looked him up.
Oh, okay.
Another thing, actually, to tie it back to my grandfather, he ran a mental health hospital in the 1950s in Peoria, Illinois, and funding was cut, and a lot of those people just wound up being homeless because nobody came and got them. Oh. And the grim reality of kind of where we're at on mental health stuff in the United States is if we don't pay to institutionalize some people to help them get better, we are going to pay in random terrorist attacks. And I mean, I don't want to I think that, trying to sort out this guy's motives when, he was dishonorably discharged from the military for drinking on duty, going AWOL and having psychological episodes. I think that's all we need to know about his motives right there. I'm much more concerned about the, and I mean, sadly, we can expect stuff like that to happen. People who do this kind of stuff, people who, blow up bombs and stuff like that, sometimes they're actually fairly intelligent and just what I would call evil, like Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City. A lot of times they're just very disturbed individuals that need mental health care. So, yeah, I don't know if he thought they were I'm pretty sure there's never been a Sikh terrorist attack. I mean, certainly in the United States. I don't know how Sikhs fit into the geopolitics of India and Pakistan, which if we can get into for a second, because this is kind of how we got on this topic about a year ago. I still find it very upsetting. Compassion International, which is a nonprofit that I've traveled with internationally, was kicked out of India. They were feeding 135,000 kids. They were kicked out of India for proselytizing, which India is supposed to have a freedom of religion situation, just like the United States does. You're an American, and if you go back past that, you're like your family is only even half tied into India. So you would say that Hinduism does not teach the caste system. I mean, do you find that American Hindus are pushing back against what's going on there? Because I mean, the reason I was upset is because this organization was doing nothing but feeding kids, and they were kicked out for kind of violating the rules.
Yeah, I don't know the particulars of that situation with that organization, but there's a huge push in India by conservatives and Hindus. And keep in mind, India is rapidly developing. The culture is rapidly changing. It's becoming more modern. Women aren't getting married off into their in-laws' families like in the old days. They're pursuing their own careers. The way of dressing is changing. Movies are becoming more risque. And I think that because of that, there's a huge pushback in India. And I'm not saying this is right, but it's what's happening. There's a huge pushback against outside influences that are seen as a threat to the local historical culture. Now, the world is changing, and every culture is going to evolve over time. But I think we've seen this before, and all over the place, where there's always a pushback against change. And I'm not saying this to justify, that this charity was removed from doing their work. I think any charity that's doing honorable work should be allowed to continue their practices unencumbered. But I think my understanding of the situation was that the charity was seen as doing the work under the requirement that the people that they're helping are either learning about the faith that
The Christian faith, yeah.
Right. Or converting, or whatever the case may be. And for that reason, I think they were warned, and then but I don't know the particulars, so I don't know.
Well, and I can't vouch for them either. I've seen what they're doing in Latin America. I haven't been to Asia, so that may well have been the case. So, I mean, you would say that the caste system is in no way part of Hinduism. Would traditional Hindus in India say differently? I mean, it's because something's keeping this alive. And what's funny to me is it actually seems kind of close to the MAGA, Donald Trump thing, where we're pushing back towards like an earlier day or something like that.
Mm-hmm. So, the caste system, I think it's so widely misunderstood. There's a caste system, and that's undeniable, that exists in India. And there's so for example, my family, and we, I guess I was brought up more seeing it as a community rather than the way that the caste system is perceived to be typically. So people in our community have grown up being builders, carpenters, architects, and for many generations going back, this is what people in our family have been. They encourage marrying within the community to preserve the cultural heritage and the community heritage. And there is some sort of hierarchy there too, where certain communities can't marry within others, and so on and so forth. I think back in the day, adhered to pretty strictly. Now it's, from what I understand, it's being used primarily to suppress people in lower classes and kind of make it very difficult for them to break out of the life that they were born into, so to speak. So, there's a lot of things about this caste system. I don't agree with it. And I think you'll find that today in modern India, if you go in the cities and so on, people are rejecting this. But if you go into these rural areas where people are still, living, it is not developing evenly throughout its, it's, the cities are developing, rural areas are still rural, and they're still being kept kind of back in time. I think it's going to take some time for that to change, but that's where some of these like strict adherence to these old antiquated beliefs are still, being found.
Yeah, and that in rural areas, kind of untouched by urban life, if you will. Does that still include a pretty heavy dose of prearranged marriage? I know culturally that's a lot more like from what my friend's neighbor told me. They were immigrants from India. They said that they were basically on like a online dating site, and instead of dating, they just give you somebody and you marry them, and you just go. For it. Which we have that now in the United States. It's a TV show called Married at First Sight, and we now have prearranged marriage via reality television.
Right. So, I mean, my parents have an arranged marriage, and even though my father was born and brought up in East Africa, he was born to a family from the same community as my mother. My mother was born in, I wouldn't say a rural area, but a smaller town, but she grew up primarily in Mumbai, and her father knew my paternal grandmother somehow, and at the time, my grandmother, I think, was a widow. My grandfather had died at a very young age, in his. So somehow this was, this marriage was arranged where my mom has a brother. And that brother was married off to my dad's sister. So it's really close in the community. It's sort of like, we have 2 kids. Mm-hmm. You have 2 kids. Both of these guys are going to be successful. These ladies will have nice lives. Let's, make this match. And my aunt and uncle are still together, and they still live in Mumbai. They're doing great. And my parents are, they have a very happy marriage as well. You hear about the success rate of arranged marriages. I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that divorce is really frowned upon in the culture, and that there's all kinds of social constructs that would discourage a woman from leaving her husband or a man from leaving his wife. And so I think that contributes to the success rate as well. But in my family, I'm happy to report that it has worked out.
Well, were there kids, kind of growing up in Flint that were expected to be, have an American arranged marriage, or was that not a thing? Because, I do know some Indian families that, like, from what I understood, they expected their kids to kind of have the same situation.
Yeah. So there's something we call auntie meddling. And in our culture, our parents' friends or people of that generation, we always call them auntie or uncle as a sign of respect for our elders, right?
Yeah.
But my mother will occasionally call me and say, oh, such and such auntie was saying that she knows somebody who is looking for a match in Chicago. So there is that kind of, so I wouldn't say it's an arrangement, but people do look out for their kids. They want them to get married within the community, or at least within the Indian Hindu community, if possible, in many cases. So you'll see that happen, and that's what I've seen happen. I know of a handful of people that I went to college with who grew up in the Indian community here who have had matches that were encouraged by their parents, but it wasn't an arranged marriage in the sense that they got to know each other. They went through the dating process. They made the decisions on their own that this was the right match for them. And, but I do have some people in my family in India who have had arranged marriages, even in this generation. We're seeing it kind of fizzle out, that practice, but it's still prevalent.
Yeah, well, that's one of those things Americans just really can't say anything about with the divorce rate we have. Like, as a culture, it's just ain't much we can say. If we can get into a bit of geopolitics here to, maybe help people. And I mean, you're American, so,
right.
I don't know how much you've traveled back and forth, or, have you been over, I guess, to India? Or
I have, and I will. 2009 was the last time, but I'll go again in January.
Oh, are you? Okay. Have you been to Africa or no?
Yeah.
Where your dad lived or not?
Yeah, as kids, my father took us to see his. He's from Islam, so we went there, and then we got to go on the safaris and all that stuff. It was a very long time ago, and I wish I could have a better memory of those experiences. They
Lost
were
a lot.
amazing, but I was
Yeah.
just too young to really remember it all. But yeah, I do go back from time to time to India. I think as I get older and I have more of an appreciation for that culture, but also it's really cool to go back and see how it's changing. If you look at Bombay 10 years ago versus last time I went was in 2009, it is a totally different city, and I can only imagine now when I go back, it'll be a totally different city again. So it's kind of cool to see the
Yeah.
place evolve.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, India and Brazil are massively, massively becoming economic players where they haven't been. Everybody talked about, kind of the upswing of China, and now India and Brazil are kind of on that same track. Ironically, China may not be able to hold their economy because their one-child policy. They're not going to have enough workers without immigration. Oddly enough, you actually need a growing population, and they didn't allow people to have more than one kid. And so, whether or not they can hold that is certainly up for debate right now. I want to get a little bit into the tensions of that region, because we tend to see everything from an Americanized point of view, like every single international relations thing, America has some kind of influence on, right? Traditionally, the
Right.
United States has been much more aligned with Pakistan, and when there's this especially when the MAGA hats came out, and then you kind of had this thing of oh, America was never great. I would say that America was a pretty dang good idea. It's if I had to go top five of nations in the history of mankind, Holland at the time the United States was founded was very progressive as far as human rights and was working very well. They were economically, they were doing great. They'd invented banking. Ancient Greece, Switzerland, and actually Pakistan was kind of founded as the great hippie dream, that everybody could actually get along. It was very it was founded on religious freedom, to where Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Christians, which is and actually there are some Jews in India as well that have been there for a very long time. That all these people could live side by side. And so the idea of Pakistan, everybody thinks it's such a backwards country. When that happened in the 70s, I'm certainly a fan of that. And that has not been the case now. You have gay people getting thrown off of buildings, and you have, the Taliban, burning people alive from not being Muslim enough. It didn't work out.
Right.
But, India is such a big place. It's such a developing place. And it does endure a good amount of terrorism. And it's a nuclear power up against, bumping up against another nuclear power with, this glacier in between them of nukes pointed at each other.
Mhm.
What's there are 5 religions that don't always get along there. What's your take on all that? What's the, what do you at least want people to get kind of the 30,000 foot overview of?
Yeah, it's so interesting because all these religions that have roots in India all preach for peaceful coexistence, and yet we have these warring tribes, or there's a lot of religious retaliation. For example, if someone bombs a temple, then the Hindus will get together and bomb 2 mosques in retaliation, and this kind of thing. Years ago, there were riots in the state of Gujarat, and I believe at the time the I guess you could call him the governor or the head of the state of Gujarat had issued a statement calling on the police to basically ignore for a small period of time these attacks that were taking place from Hindus towards Muslims. And it was all out of retaliation for, there was a train bombing or something of that sort that sparked all of this. But thousands and thousands of people were massacred in this. And the head of the state actually stood by kind of and let it happen for a period of time before he allowed the authorities to put an end to it. So, I think it's always sad to see this kind of violence or hatred from groups. We all want the same thing. We want to preserve our cultures. We want peace. We want our next generation to have a good world to live in. And it's disturbing to see this. There's a lot of long brewing tensions, particularly between the Hindu and the Muslim cultures in India. A lot of it has to do with going back to partition when the countries were given their independence. But
I think it's hard for Americans who grew up in a country that's 5 minutes old on the global stage to get your head around, so to go back to Christianity, which is what I'm going to know a little more, right? Because India was a flourishing society, there were ethnic and religious Jews, which you kind of have to say both, because there are certainly people of Jewish descent that are not Jewish in the United States, or Israeli descent, or whatever you want to say. Like my wife is ethnically half, but a Christian by faith, right? There were a lot of Jews in India because of the global trade. And then a good number of those Jews became Christians with early Christian missionary journeys immediately after the death of Jesus. And then those people were found in maybe 1400 AD, 1600, somewhere in there. And were under severe persecution from European Catholics for not doing Christianity the right way. And so there's all this stuff that because Americans tend to think of ourselves at the center of the global stage. God forbid there's ever another nuke shot. It's at least as likely probably to be between India and Pakistan as North Korea and the United States, because it's always tense right there. And there's so much more geographic closeness for something like that to happen. And obviously that's horrifying. And we are at the anniversary of, the United States using it, and that should never happen again. But it's very, very complicated as to what to do with this region. The Middle East actually is more diverse than most people think. You're like, man, you invited me on this podcast, you don't let me talk. But the Yazidi religion in the Middle East is not something we talk about. So there's really more like 4 or 5 players in the Middle East, and not just Jews and Muslims. I think that India and Pakistan are, a very similar situation where there's 4 or 5 players, and 2 of them are major, and then you kind of have 3 minors, right? What we do with those areas, and then the third area being not so much for religion, but more for perceived ethnicity and tribal reasons, the Balkan states, and then maybe after that, the Central Congo, where we forced African tribes together that didn't want to be a country and have been more or less at war for 30 years over it. As far as how we kind of reduce suffering and violence, I don't even know what to say. But those are all the same situation, where there's 4 or 5 groups that are at each other's throats, and we haven't figured out for hundreds of years how to calm it down.
Right. Yeah. If we think about it, if you break it down, people have so much passion about their faith, right? I feel like that's maybe even in our culture here in the U.S. going away a little bit.
Well, because
we still see people are going to church and so on, but
because those people are becoming nothings. Hey, I have, not even I'm an atheist exactly. Just I have no particular belief situation. If you have nothing in particular, it's hard to be really passionate about nothing in particular.
Right, but then in these areas where people are still very passionate, and so I think they see these. Whoever they see as others as more of a threat now, because I think wherever you look in the world, faith beliefs are constantly evolving and being challenged from outside sources, right? So I think it's less a part of our culture here. You know, my mother still wakes up morning and does her prayers, and she sticks to a strict vegetarian diet. She has a calendar where she observes all the holidays and keeps all the religious practices. To be honest, I know very little about that, you know, and we were exposed to it. We were taught all of it, but it would be a part-time job to manage a Hindu religious calendar. So, you know, I'm not a very religious person. I would say, you know, I appreciate the culture. I appreciate the spirituality, and those sort of things. But other than some major holidays that we observe for cultural reasons, I would say I'm a pretty terrible Hindu. I have chicken stew brewing on my stove right now as I talk to you. So, you know, but how do you get people to step out of this mindset that they're so passionate about something, and sometimes that passion leads to becoming closed-minded. And when people are closed-minded, they're not willing to see any other viewpoint. I think that's where this sort of dangerous violence and anger and hatred start brewing from that, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, like, I want to be a person who, this whole thing is about kind of trying to create common ground where there isn't some, right? You know,
Right.
One of the things that's hard for me to get my head around with Hinduism is, you know, with all Near East religions, so the big three being obviously Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they are all, everything is around the interpretation of a single book or a collection of books, right?
Right.
Hinduism does not have that. That's correct, right?
Right. So, I mean, there are holy texts, but there's not a single holy text, right? And Hinduism itself is not a very organized religion. You'll find that people approach Hinduism differently all over the place.
Yeah.
And even if you come to Chicago and go to any of our temples in the suburbs or wherever, you will find people in there worshiping in their own way. As opposed to, say, you know, when you go to church, you go at a given time, and it's very structured. You know, the service, please correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah, no,
I went to Catholic high school, so I was brought up with a lot of exposure to Catholicism and Christianity, and so I've probably been to more church in my life than many Christians.
Many Christians, yeah.
But what I appreciate about the church service is that it is structured. You know, there's a format that's consistent. And in Hinduism, it's just it's not like that at all. When you go to a service at a temple, a Hindu temple, you'll see some people praying according to their own, you know, own format that they were brought up in. It's very free flow. There's, you know, all the different idols that are placed there, and people can walk around and do a prayer in front of one before they move to the other, that kind of thing. Some people just sit quietly in the middle. There are times where the priests will sit and do a specific service. Then you can just sit quietly and kind of observe and listen. But it's just not organized. And even in Christianity, there's so many denominations, but they all have some sort of structure. And Hinduism just doesn't have that. It's a very fluid. You know, I think it's one of the most ancient of religions. It has developed differently in different areas of India and throughout the world. And so one of the cool things about it is it's very diverse, but it is different in that regard. So, you know, there are Hindus who also believe in other religions. I know several people who are Buddhists. They're Hindus, but they're Hindu and Buddhists as well. And Hinduism kind of makes allowance where I think most religions do not.
Yeah. Well, where
you
that
could not be a practicing Muslim and a practicing Christian at the same time, right? You could believe in some of both, and there's some overlap there as well in beliefs, but it's just more structured. And I think that structure works for followers of those faiths, and I think that structure is also probably a good reason why those faiths were able to develop and spread so fast in their history, relatively short history compared to Hinduism.
Yeah, and to use the term evangelical, meaning like that you are called to spread something. Islam is pretty evangelical throughout the world. Judaism is not. Christianity is. I would say Hinduism is not. Hinduism has not been particularly concerned with taking it to Russia or Japan or something like that, where it's kind of spread organically as far as historically goes. When we talk through the lens of how do we get people to get along, really more than anybody else, it's on Muslims to reduce Muslim terrorism, because they're the ones that can, because as soon as it becomes not a part of the belief system, that you should be blowing up and obviously I'm not saying all Muslims, there's two major branches, right? But when it's no longer acceptable within any major branch of Islam to, blow yourself up, you're going to get it a lot less, right? And that conversation comes back to how do Muslims interpret the Quran? I actually, if God is Allah, and I'm a pagan, I've read the Quran, and I would probably go with, the more, based on what the book says, I would go with the people who are the more militant ones, are more right. And obviously that's not what I want, and that's not what I think of all Muslims. Like when my brother was dying of cancer, his doctor was a female Muslim doctor, and one of the most important people in my life probably ever, right?
Right.
But all these conversations really stem around interpretations of very old texts, like what they mean today to get people to get along. What's interesting about Hinduism in that mix, and maybe Sikhism, because I don't know it that well, is like that, really the key is to get people to not be violent because of these texts in various religions. It becomes kind of a different problem or a different situation when, to reduce violence when that isn't there, because you don't go back to, kind of the Near Eastern tradition of like going back to a text. When there isn't one, it becomes more complicated as to how you would say to Hindus, stop blowing up Muslim temples.
Right. Yeah, and I think, with regards to religious texts, there's objectionable things in all of them. And like you said, it's really about interpretation. Well,
and, to defend all of them, they would all say, what you're seeing is objectionable. We're seeing is you're not interpreting correctly. But totally go ahead.
But so how do you, to my knowledge, at least in the U.S., the Muslim community has really come together and united against and condemned any attacks. They do a bit of fundraising and things like that. They've made donations to rebuild churches even that have been destroyed and that kind of thing. I think I read recently about a mosque that is allowing a neighboring church to use their space for services while there's some reconstruction activity going on. And so we do see some condemnation and things. I think, there's just this growing sentiment, because a lot of the terror is coming from, the groups that call themselves religious extremist groups in the name of Islam. But it's kind of, we have to separate the religion, I think, from the acts of these people. Just because they're
committing these acts in the name of the religion does not make it a religious act that they're doing. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's hard for me to see that they take themselves seriously as religious followers of any faith and are still able to go out and just cause so much destruction through terrorism.
Yeah, and I mean, that's tough, right? Because like Muhammad beheaded 700 Jews in one day. Muhammad seemed to be a little more okay with Christianity. And I don't think of that, of, American Muslims as people who, want to, or even like, let's just say there's this huge unemployment issue in Gaza right now, in the Gaza Strip, which is going to lead to more terrorism because people will sit around with nothing to do but get pissed off. They go out and cause bad things to happen. And that includes American, rough neighborhoods where high school kids can't get jobs. What do? They sell drugs. Like that's just what happens. We know that's what's going to happen every time. Where you and I probably differ is I actually do see, like I can see both sides of the Islam debate, like kind of the more conservative and the more liberal branches. I can see both of them as having, if Islam is true, that I can see both of them as having solid ground to stand on, that they're right. Okay, and what we're supposed to say is, no, this is all religion of peace. Like all religions are religions of peace. And, these are outliers. I mean, I've read the Quran and there's a case to be made for violence. If this is the true thing, if this is the true thing humanity is supposed to be following, which I don't think, but if that does turn out to be, that's the case, it's hard to read it and not think that it says to do violence and the founder did violence. So why wouldn't we be doing violence? That's not what I want. What I want is, first of all, for people of whatever faith to be respected in the United States and for freedom of religion to exist, and for people not to kill each other. But I've also read the book, and that's what the book says.
Yeah, and to be honest, I read it so long ago that my memory of details is not great. But
yeah, well, and you're not a Muslim, so I'm not asking you to be a Muslim. Whatever.
I also, kind of, and I guess because I grew up around a lot of people of the Islamic faith and have many friends who are Muslim, I kind of, I can't, my head, make any correlation between the extremist and then these people who are wonderful, peace-loving people. And like I said, I haven't read the book in years. I don't know, can't defend the Quran in that regard. But, regardless of that, what we're seeing in this culture, and I think people are partially emboldened by our current political situation. We have a president who openly says things to incite this kind of hatred towards other groups. And I'm not blaming Mr. Trump specifically, but the course, the direction I think that our country has taken has emboldened people who maybe had some hatred in their heart from before to now come public with it. I think there's a lot of probably contributing factors, right? Social media is one. Now you can find any group to reinforce your beliefs, no matter what your beliefs are. There's probably a Facebook group of people who believe the sky is green. And if you believe the sky is green, you can join that group and validate your beliefs and spread whatever misinformation that you want to. But it just seems like rather than becoming a more tolerant society, as has been the trend until recently, it now seems that the ship has kind of turned course. And I don't know where we're headed with this, but we have a president who did not condemn the shooting of two Indian people in.
Well, he eventually did because there was he kind of phoned.
He was called on.
He eventually phoned it in, so I don't think. I mean, it's hard for me to judge somebody else's heart.
It was a passing mention.
Yeah,
it was a passing mention. speech. And I think because at that point, and this was also over a week later, he was compelled to do so probably by his advisors. It should have been immediately condemned. Any act of violence should be immediately, when it's a national story and it's rooted in hate, it should be immediately condemned without question, without any thought. And I think when we see something like this happen and it's not taken seriously or perceived to not be taken seriously by our president, it made a lot of people in my community, a lot of people like me, feel almost slighted, you know.
Well, no, it absolutely should. It absolutely.
So, and we have, you know, we haven't had presidents in the past who have kind of turned an eye to this type of behavior. Usually, there would be some sort of message or some sort of call for unity, things like that, when these type of events take place. You know, thankfully, we have not seen any sort of mass attack or terrorism since Trump has taken office, at least on our soil, on a huge level. We've had some smaller ones, but still, it'll be interesting to see how that is handled and how.
Yeah, let me speak to what I will do if this happens in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Okay, you know, because this happened before, immediately after 9/11. If there's another terrorist attack that is by Muslims or blamed on Muslims to where there could be a pushback against that, we have open carry. I can open carry a firearm here in the state of Wisconsin. I promise you, I will be in a lawn chair in the driveway of the mosque here in Kenosha. And if anybody wants to come at any of those people, like, I mean, good luck. Kill me first. And my family is historically pretty hard to kill. So good luck. I mean, that's going to be the first place I go.
Well, that's an admirable position.
Yeah. And at the same time, I believe that, that if the people that are studying that book, that are studying the Quran, if they were reading it correctly, they should want to be on the other side of things and shoot me in the back of the head. Maybe not, but there's certainly, I don't think that there's a case, like, I'm not completely sold on, if you're interpreting Islam correctly, that that it's peaceful. I'm not sold on it. I'd love to have a Muslim on that could convince me. I'd love to think that, but I'm not sold on it right now. But I was not able to do military service due to double disqualification. I have an extra rib and I'm allergic to nuts. I was not allowed in the military. But if somebody wants to kill somebody in my town, and I know there's a pretty good chance of it, I'm going to go sit with a loaded firearm in the driveway and they're going to have to kill me first.
And that's an admirable position. I think, it's sometimes we have to defend people other than ourselves against sometimes ourselves, and we need more of that kind of thinking, more of that sort of looking out for one another. And that sentiment is what I feel like we're losing a little bit. So yeah. It's good to hear that from you, and good to hear that from, when you see evidence of that out there. But we're also seeing a lot of evidence of the opposite, right? We're seeing a lot of it's a little disappointing, because as time goes on, we should be progressing. We should be working towards more peace and not spreading this. But like so many factors to it right now, and the world that we live in. And I think media, social media, the political climate, the divisiveness in Washington and everywhere else, it used to be that you could sit and chit chat with someone who was politically affiliated differently than you in reasonable conversation. And now a lot of times you just see a lot of, slinging of garbage across the aisle. And we have to recognize wherever our political affiliation is, there are faults there with both parties. And we should be able to have these kind of discussions without resorting to or devolving into name calling and arguing. And we're just seeing so much more of that. And maybe that's just my perception, but I think that.
Oh no! I mean, we're definitely getting dumber in some ways, and if I can kind of put a bow on this whole thing, if there's a thesis statement that I could get out of this conversation, it is that the people who are going to have the most power to change something, and I'm not sure I'm convinced of your take on, but also you're an American, so I mean, you didn't live in it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I'm 100% convinced on your take on the caste system in India. But if there's somebody that's going to fix that allows people to have more mobility, it's not Jews or Christians or Sikhs. It's Muslims. If there's somebody that's going to cut down on terrorism, the number one thing is Muslims. Wherever that's, and for Christians, it's condemning the alt-right right now, quite frankly. There's way too much Christianity, and I think it's still fringe Christianity, but there's way too much Christianity that's kind of cool with the whole alt-right thing. When you start to ask how we start to fix some of these big problems, it is that each group kind of has to self-police if we're going to bring the temperature down in the room. The other thing is that in my opinion, when you talk about like things becoming more divisive, and I've said almost every episode on the podcast at this point, it's because society has now allowed us to live in a country where we don't have to depend on other people as much, and then you can self-select with just people who are more extreme, right? When you're not forced into it, you actually are forced into it because you live in such a diverse zip code, but most of us are not. I think the other big answer, the big takeaway is that everybody wants to have a voice about national politics, and almost nobody's doing anything within 5 miles of their house. And wherever you're at, I think you need to realize that you're a lot less important than you think you are. And for whatever I've screwed up with the first 30 episodes of this thing, I have no delusions of grandeur that I'm Bono. I realize that I do have an audience, and it's in 46 states, and we're up over 30,000 listens to this thing. But that's a drop in the bucket. And most things that I'm going to do to produce change are geographically close to me. Saying some things on social media are important sometimes, but actual change in the world comes from you putting down your phone.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I'd love to see any evidence of someone reading a story that their Facebook friend posted that changed their mind, substantially on any important viewpoint. I think even when you see people kind of posting whatever the agenda is, an article to support their belief, typically you're going to see that someone on the other side is either going to scroll right past it and roll their eyes maybe, or comment back with a opposing viewpoint, right? So I guess I think you're right in the sense that like there's no dialogue being had, substantial productive dialogue where we're learning from each other anymore, because the information is so readily available already for us to support our own belief that we don't need to discuss it. This is becoming a problem, right? Because now, remember when we were growing up, I think you're probably around the same age as me, plus or minus a few years, right? But
yeah,
growing up, there was CBS, ABC, and NBC News. And, there was no Fox News. There was no Drudge Report. There was no, and now there's any hundreds of options that we can go to source information to validate ourselves, rather than before we would go to town halls or whatever and have real discussion, actually listen to people. I think the listening is turned off in America right now, Well,
maybe if I can throw something on there, I think the diversity of journalism is a good thing. But all of democracy rests on the average Joe's critical thinking skills. If you go back and read again, I'm repeating myself from various episodes, but if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, which were written to the common New York farmer, right? 90% of college freshmen can't get their head around the ideas in that thing. So while we have much more formal education and much more information, that doesn't always translate into being able to get your head around an idea or argue or debate or possess critical thinking skills. The other thing, when you talked about posting kind of inflammatory stuff on social media, nobody, I don't think anybody ever does change their mind on one article. When somebody changes their mind on something, it usually takes years, especially if it's a deeply held belief. And so, right. What I'm trying to do here, and what's funny is that actually the reason that this and a few other outlets that are kind of like this are working, is because it's just so weird compared to what everybody else is doing. I did a podcast that just failed. I did 100, maybe 50 to 100, listens per episode. And it just kind of burned out because nobody cared that much. And then as I said before, I'm not that brilliant. I just kind of hit the right moment to where this is almost countercultural, to have a conversation like this. And so it sticks out because it's weird. I gotta let you get back to work, and I gotta actually got another one of these in 30 minutes. Anything else that you just kind of want to lay out there, or that I may have, kind of screwed up as far as what I was, how I was describing these different things, we got in pretty deep into geopolitics, religion, and international conflict. Anything that I kind of messed up there, or no?
No, I mean, I think we agree on a lot of stuff, and we differ in our viewpoints on a few things. But I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this, and I think keep doing what you're doing. It's really important that we get more dialogue like this out there, because I think when someone can sit, listen, and hear a reasonable dialogue without sort of what you hear the talking heads on TV doing, all the what's the word I'm looking for? Just the divisive banter and that kind of thing. I think that this is more productive. I think if we had more of this type of dialogue in media, we'd all be in a better spot.
Hey, do you want to just shout out your business real quick? Because you are my accountant, and I went through 3 or 4 accountants before I found somebody I liked. So I do think it's worth, maybe just letting somebody know if they're looking for an accountant, just your URL or how to get a hold of you or whatever.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'm at mzpartners.com is how you can find me. So that's MZ as in zebra, partners.com.
All right. Aash Mawada, mzpartners.com. You can also check that out in the show notes.